Yeah? Awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to NDC. Awesome to see you all here. Hands up for your first time here. NDC is mine too. Great. Awesome. So, event-driven architectures, okay? What do they look like? Often you see this. Producers, right? Some kind of broker, channel in the middle, publishing a message, an event, whatever that looks like, and a consumer. Hands up if you're building event-driven or message-based systems today. Cool, you come to the right place. For those who have not, this is event-driven architecture in one slide. I can almost guarantee most of you have kind of drawn these boxes before. 3 boxes and 2 lines. Now the question is, I often have with event-driven architectures is how can something so simple, right, end up so complicated? Discoverability issues, versioning your events, different boundaries, choreography, orchestration, debugging, ownership, ordering, idempotency, lack of schema design. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. And what I want to do in this talk with you today is talk about how we can navigate some of this complexity, right? And how we can use domain-driven design, ideas, and approaches to be able to do that. Before we get started, I introduce myself. My name is Dave Boyne. I'm actually an independent open source developer. I focus full-time open source code now, which is really cool, and consultancy on the side. Previously worked at AWS. I spent the last 10 years just diving deep into event-driven message-based systems. I worked with Async API, which is an open specifications startups and enterprises for the last 20-odd years. I love standards. I love governance, I love documentation, and I love the boring stuff, okay? And this is also my first time in Denmark, so it's really, really cool to be here. So what we're going to be talking about today is 3 main areas, really. First of all, I want to talk to you about complexity with event architectures. Where does it come from? Where does it sneak up on you? And it's not a kind of if, it's more of a when does it occur? Then we'll look at domain-driven design, look at the book that's 23 years old, right, and take elements of this. How can that help us manage some of this complexity? Finally, I want to talk about governance and open source, standards, specifications, things that are emerging that can really help us. At the end, I have a summary of the resources and everything else, so if you want to take pictures, go ahead. If you don't, sit back, relax. They're all at the end anyway. So before we get started, I think it's just important to understand where the hell we come from. And the adoption of event-driven architecture is actually growing, okay? And it's an interesting thing because we've been building message-based systems for years, right? Gregor Hopp has a great book called Enterprise Integration Patterns. That was 20 years ago, talking about messages, bus queues, filtering, routing, all sorts of things. If you actually go back further, you can find white papers on messages 30, 40 years ago. So why event-driven? Why event-driven architecture? Why are we talking about this stuff? And really, all that's kind of happened is this, is that event-driven architectures are becoming accessible to us, that we can lean onto the shoulders of the giants, Azure, Google with PubSub, AWS, SQS, SNS, whatever else. We have Confluent, the big Kafka giant in that space, right? We have Solace with their own event bus. We have Gravity doing API meshes. We have Cloudflare coming up from the ground and just eating some of this pie, doing some interesting things. Red Panda. We have investment in startups along the bottom. Ingest, Restate, Temporal, doing durable functions, doing all about events and messages. And event-driven architecture is an interesting thing because when we look at event-driven architectures, we are promised the holy grail, right? We are promised scalability, decoupled architectures, fault tolerance. We're promised business agility and this evolutionary architecture that we can just build upon. And some of that promises is true, okay? You will feel some of this. And what's happening out there is this. It's becoming easier and easier for us to publish messages. So all you have to do is take a message and publish it onto a channel. Now, how do you do that? You install an SDK, and you publish it into the cloud. Job done. Consumer comes along and consumes this thing. Now, this interesting thing happens here, is that when you do that, you see this value, right? This bump in value that you've just got. You've implemented event-driven architectures. You have this value of the initial producers and consumers, and then we're adding consumers over time. It's so easy just to raise a message onto a queue, onto a bus, onto a whatever it is, a channel, and start consuming them. The problem with all of this is that that value tends to plateau over time, right? And why is that? It's because complexity starts to sneak into your architecture. Implementation versus behavior thinking. So easy just to implement events. Just YOLO it. Land of standards, governance, unclear boundaries, leaking information in your events, coupling through the event design itself. Even as a consumer, how you consume an event can just couple you directly back to a chaotic mess. And then this interesting value thing, when we map complexity, you start to see this. That complexity tends to just come up over time. That complexity, when you build these types of architectures, these distributed systems on messages, rapidly increases over time. Why is that? It's because we have our initial producers and consumers at the start. Everything is good. Everything is great. And then over time, we have like these assumptions that are being made. Over time, lack of standards, discoverability, ownership, versioning, what goes inside our events. No one really knows. When you dive into complexity itself, there tends to be 3 levels. Most of us stop at 2. Essential complexity, right? There is no getting away from this. Your domain is essentially complex. So banking system, messaging system, whatever it is you need to do, you're just in a complex domain. We have technical complexity with message-based architectures, event-driven architecture. We have idempotency, being able to retry things when we replay events. Side effects or no side effects, exactly once processing. Retry handling, fault tolerance, cap theorem. When you dive into event architectures, you will come across these things, come across these problems, and you'll start to read. Now, most of us as architects and developers, we tend to just stay there, and we tend to just put a lot of time and effort in there. Unfortunately, what happens is this accidental complexity comes into your architecture. So things like versioning. How do you version your events? Coupling, governance, big balls of mud. I've spoke to hundreds and hundreds of organizations out there building these kind of systems, and like 6, 7 out of 10 just have distributed mud, okay? Ownership, boundaries. And this is the area I think we're going to be focusing on in this talk. Earlier in the year, I watched a talk by Peter van Hardenberg. He has a talk on complexity. If you want to dive deeper, it's at the end. But he mentions this. He mentions that complexity is not necessarily linked to the size of what we're trying to do, but when systems start to interact. And that's all we are doing when it comes to event-driven architectures. We are just interacting with messages. So let's have a look at the warning signs when it comes to these things. Let's take it back to basics. Producers, channels, and consumers. So we as architects and developers, we say, yes, we're going to create a decoupled architecture. This is fantastic. We go to the whiteboard and we do this. We have boxes, and we have lines, and we have consumers, and we have messages that go between them all. And we sit back and we look and we say, look at this decoupled architecture. It's beautiful. In fact, as time goes on, we have more channels, more things, more patterns emerge. Change data capture. We can listen to changes in a database and react to them. Cool, let's put that on there. We have letter queues. Let's put that on there to capture some messages, whatever else. And what happens in your organization is people start to look, people on this old legacy rubbish. We want a piece of this. We want to keep going. And as I said, the barrier to entry to this architecture type is almost 0. So to be able to implement something like this is actually quite trivial. But what have we actually done, in fact, is create a big ball of distributed mud. Okay? As I said, most people I speak to end up in some form of this. Now, a big ball of mud comes from domain-driven design, but it even comes before that in a white paper by Brian Futte and Joseph Yoder. I don't expect you to read all of this, but there are 3 areas which stood out to me. Number one, unregulated growth. Now think of your producers, your consumers. Oh, by the way, your producers don't know about consumers, so we just keep going and going and going. You have information shared freely amongst the system. What goes inside your events? Don't know, don't care. Put everything in the event, maybe not. What about PII information? Who can control this stuff? Don't know. Structure of the system may have never well been defined in the first place. So this is like stuff and complexity and big balls of mud. It's so easy to fall into this trap. Unregulated growth, as I said, lack of system design. And this is like the number one here. The number one warning sign of complexity is beware of big balls of mud. Like, hands up if you've experienced a big ball of mud in your system so far. Over half the room. And for those who have not, it's coming for you. So let's go back again. Complexity, start with simple, producer, consumer, and channel. Everything is simple here. We are tasked as the order team to create some events. Brilliant, awesome. Let's start doing this. So we have the order-placed event. Someone, somewhere has decided they need to know when the order has been placed. So we create an envelope, we put a message inside, and we create the order placed. Now, the naming of this event is a mutable fact that has happened. Order placed sounds okay. We've done our research online. This is awesome. Thumbs up so far. We have a source, right? A source of like myapp.orders, the domain, the service. Where is this event coming from? Pretty good practice, you know, myapp.orders, nothing wrong there. Now we have the message in the envelope, right? So what do we put inside of our event? Well, we put the order ID in there, and we put the user ID in there. What else do you need? Great. Thumbs up. Your consumers will start consuming this, and everything is fine. Next, we are tasked with the order cancelled event. 3 weeks, 3 months later, doesn't really matter. So we decide to do this. We have done this before. We can just copy and paste what the hell we had. So we do that. We have the order cancelled event. We have the detail type and the source. That's great. And inside the envelope, we have a reason that is no longer needed. Okay, well, a consumer, let's say a notification system, an email system, could probably take that information and put this inside of an email. It's kind of useful. Why was the order cancelled? Type T_W. Does anyone know what that means when you cancel an order? No one? And I don't know what it means, and I made the slide. But what I'm getting at here is we have implementation details from that domain, that boundary, that system, starting to leak inside the event. But we don't care, we just keep going. In fact, we have the user, but this time we have a user object. Last time we had the user ID. We have the ID in there, so it doesn't really matter. We have first name, last name in there. Does that matter? Is this PII information? Can consumers even read this? Don't know, don't care. And what tends to happen in organizations is we just keep going. We just keep going and going and going. We have payment events. We have order events, fulfillment events. We have invoice events. In fact, the invoice team at the bottom start to use commands as events. Send the invoice email as an event. Some kind of code smells, some weird trade-offs, and things are happening here. We start to keep going. We have order updated event. We're using CRUD-based events now. Awesome stuff. Order updated. Why was the order updated? Is it a name and the address? Is it the amount and the order? Has it been whatever? We don't know. We just let the consumers work that out themselves. So we just have CRUD-based event naming conventions. And again, as I said, this is so easy for us to do. It's just so easy to put this onto an SDK, onto a bus. In fact, you end up in a weird and wonderful world where we've just added complexity without even realizing. We have things that I like to call YOLO events. It's like you only live once. We just chuck this thing onto the bus. Who cares? We have lack of standards, and we're exposing implementation details. So, okay. Warning signs. Number 2, inconsistent conventions. YOLO events, exposing information, and lack of standards. So even if we continue to go on this path into complexity and where it comes, The next question, the big question on your teams at some point, maybe not at the start, but sometime you'll start thinking about what the hell actually goes inside our events. So you start to Google event patterns. What goes inside our events? Best practices. You start to see things like this. Notification events, right? We are notifying the system that something has happened. Notification events are thin in contract. There's not too much to this. Your downstream consumers give you a big thumbs up and say, awesome, you've given me the information. That's great. I have the order ID and I have the user ID. Now, the question really is, how useful is this for downstream consumers? Your consumers probably think it is, but what tends to happen is this, is we just introduce some kind of back pressure. So all the consumers say is, hey, I'm going to need some information about the user or the order. Can you please get it for me? Now, this might be okay. This is an okay pattern to do if your consumers need up-to-date information. But we haven't given them a choice here, so they're going to just go back and get this information, all from the event design itself. And what happens, of course, more consumers come on board. And by the way, the producer has no idea because we're decoupled and producers don't know about consumers, right? And producer or the service gets overwhelmed. And I've been there before, I've implemented this pattern, and it's pretty goddamn painful. So what's the alternative? The alternative, that is, we put everything in the event, right? The big fat events. This is actually called event carries state transfer. We've read online, this is awesome stuff. Now, consumers say, thank you very much. I no longer have to get the information I need, and they're all happy. Awesome. Until the producer one day comes along and says, oh, by the way, we don't want to put this stuff in our payload anymore. We haven't got any versioning control in our events, because guess what? Who the hell does that? So what we're going to do is just publish this thing and remove it. Am I going to break anyone? I don't know, because I don't know who's consuming the events. Now, this story ends up like this. Number one, consumer is very happy. They've actually followed some good practices. Postal laws is an example of this. Be conservative in what you do and liberal in what you expect from others. What I mean by this is, hey, I'm only interested in the order details or this order item. I'm just going to validate for that. Consumer one's happy. Consumer at the bottom is pretty annoyed, right? Because we just broke them. We had no idea we were going to break them, but we've just done that. And a consumer in the middle has this kind of weird melting face, and the only reason I added that is because it's how I feel when I work on open source full time. So things are happening, right? And we have this architecture type. Again, it keeps growing, it keeps growing, it keeps going, and we have this loosely coupled architecture, but again, all we have done is just created this thing that this accidental complexity is starting to sneak in. Lack of design, lack of a version strategy, and coupling through the contracts themselves. So number 3 here is that accidental complexity is like lack of event design, right? If you go through this phase of implementation first, if you start building these systems, you will come across some of these. If you have not and you are building them, I would love to talk to you. I've yet to meet a company that's facing any of these problems. So, what's the problem here? And I think the problem is 2 main areas. Number one, we have this initial implementation first mindset, taking that SDK, taking that message, publishing it onto a bus, consuming that. It's so trivial to set this up, especially if you're not managing the broker yourself. So we have this implementation first, that value that we get. But the question is, well, what happens if we stop and think about behavior first, right? And as I said at the start of the talk, can domain-driven design help us here manage some of the complexity? You'll never get rid of the complexity, but we can manage it. So let's move event-driven architectures to the side for a minute and talk about domain-driven design. What is this book that can give us any value? Now, DDD tends to be split into 2 main areas when you start diving deeper. We have strategic design, which is the what and the why. And then we have the tactical, the how, the implementation of this thing. So on the left, we have things like ubiquitous language. The language in which you use in your teams, in your domains, in your context. The language that will, guess what, probably be in your events, your schemas, your organization. We have domains and bounded contexts and these things, domain models. We even have core domains supporting and generic domains. Core domains being what gives you the competitive edge in your organization. Generic being like, hey, we don't want to handle payments, let's just use Stripe, right? And supporting being whatever needs to support the core. On the other side of the fence, we have tactical. How do we implement this thing? And guess what? There's the word there, event. So DDD and event-driven architecture go very well together. We have entities and repositories and context maps, aggregates, factories. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. In fact, there are whole talks and conferences around DDD that will do exactly that. But we don't have time to go through all of this, but what we can do is pick some of these elements, pick some of these leaves from this book, and actually apply them to event-driven architecture and try and manage some of the complexity. And then when it comes down to it, all I'm saying here really is two things. Number one, on the strategic, is thinking about developing a shared understanding between your teams and your organization and the language that you can use. And then on the right, it's actually using messages to communicate between these boundaries. Okay? Because let's talk about language for a minute. Language is an interesting thing. Most complexity starts from language. It's actually misunderstandings that get released into production here. An example would be here. We have domain experts on the left, that they want something with wheels, they want a window, they want seats, whatever it is. We got that mental model, that translation, that solution model of the developers and architects, and we end up with something like a bus. Okay? Which is an interesting thing, and then when you do that, you start to introduce this understanding. That understanding leads to complexity, and we start modeling things that don't really represent what we were talking about in the first place. I tell you a story about 10, maybe about 12 years ago. I worked for a company in the UK called Compare the Market. We did lots of price comparison stuff. I joined as a software engineer, and I remember thinking it's agile transformation, things were going on back then, huge kind of stuff. I remember sitting in meetings with the business, right? We called them the business. I have no idea why, it just happened. The business would talk about what they wanted, right? What they needed to do. And I remember feeling at the time, as a software engineer, it's my job to translate this into code, right? It's what we get paid to do. And this disconnect between the business and developers, and I could not be more wrong when I look back at it now. And the whole point of this domain-driven design and domain discovery is actually working with domain experts and creating these things, terminology, language, that we can use when we start implementing some of these systems. So, domain-driven design, what can it teach us? Well, domain-driven design starts off with something called domain discovery. Right? We have visual collaboration techniques. We have teams, and we have domain experts working together. And the whole idea here really is to spread that domain knowledge. So how the hell do we do that? What is out there to let us do that? And there are a couple of techniques. Number one is event modeling. Is anyone doing event modeling here? One or two people. And the other one is event storming. Has anyone done event storming before? Okay, about a third-ish. So event storming, essentially what it is you've got Post-it notes, and we are trying to develop a story together with the domains, right? Build a model of the system together. We start with events. We use commands. We use systems. We create boundaries, okay? Very interesting model when it comes to event-driven architectures. Event storming doesn't have to be on a greenfield project. You can use event storming to improve legacy systems, explore things, explore domains. You can do big event storming sessions. Envision, explore, and design. All right? You can use this method for many different things. So let's dive a bit deeper into this. Let's have a look at envisioning something. Okay? What does it look like if we envision this event storming session? So let's pretend we're a company called Brightpath. We are an online learning platform. We have AI in there to do whatever or hell we need to do because we need a valuation of about 50 million pre-revenue. And this is us. So what we're going to do now is create this kind of event storming session. So, number one, what we do is we decide to find events. We're already using events, right? With our domain experts, with people in the room. So all we do here is say, okay, well, we have the user creates account. Okay, it sounds okay. We have assessment started, new course added. What we're trying to do here is just identify events in our system, right? It's very chaotic exploration at this point. We don't necessarily talk much between people. We're just capturing our thoughts onto something, normally onto Post-it notes on a board. Next, what we do is we put them in some kind of order. Okay? So we create a timeline along the bottom, and then the user creates an account, they can change their preferences, new course has been added, and so on. We create a story. Most people in this room could probably read this and figure out some kind of flow that's happening in the system. Again, all events, event first here. Next, we have to look at commands. We have to look at other things to add to the story. Now, if we take a step back and look at event-driven architectures, we're talking about messages. We're talking about different types of messages. Commands being things that can be rejected. Please do this. No, I cannot because of whatever reason. Queries. Please get me the information and return this back. You'll often see commands and queries everywhere in APIs, normally over HTTP protocol, right? Everyone's probably doing this. At the end here, we have events, immutable facts, things that have happened in your system, okay? Your architectures will have lots of this. Examples, here is my dog. My dog says, I want a toy. I say no, because you destroy all your toys. So I kind of reject this. A query would be what toys are available to get that information back, and the event is the toy that's been delivered. So in event storming, what happens next is this. We start to create blue Post-it notes, which represent commands. Create an account. That's maybe over HTTP, an API, whatever. And then the account has been created. We have a user up here. We define these as actors in event storming. What's actually triggering these types of behaviors? We have the content manager, users, or even systems later on. Now, the best part about all of this is this phase here, is conflict starts to emerge. Questions start to emerge. Example, is it a user, it is a customer, is it a course, or is it a lesson? Do we have auth? Do we have unauth flows? All these kind of discussions and things are happening. The language is starting to be defined in these kind of systems. So as you can see here, from conflict we gain new insights. This is a quote from DDD's GitHub resources, but I quite like that. And this kind of conflict thing that happens. So next, what happens when you're doing event storming is this areas we create red elements here. So these are kind of hotspots, things that we're going to come back to in the future. Course versus lesson, we can figure that out later. Do we have an unauth flow? Maybe we need to figure that out later. Have to be a paid member, whatever. So we start again to describe this particular story. Next, we apply systems, auth 0, lessons, content manager, recommendations, Stripe, whatever it is like that. Now, what you'll notice here, too, is like these boundaries that have started to emerge. These groups of things that have started to emerge in our discussions, in our story, as we tell it. When you do this in your organization, it'll probably look something like that. You can see we have lots of events, lots of discussion points and everything else like that. So this is the kind of thing that you probably see. And you can use online tools to help, or you could just do it like that. So the question is, like, even if we stopped here, even if you stopped at event storming, domain discovery, you have got value. You will find value. There is structured growth. You have shared understanding. And you're talking in events, right? We're already talking in events. We have domain events, business events, and all sorts of things that emerge. Because the alternative to that is implementation first. Alternative to that is the unregulated growth, lack of design, structure, YOLO events, and everything else. So we can already get value from here. But the question is, even if we do that and take that, have we beaten complexity yet? And the answer to that is, well, definitely not. There's still elements of complexity in here. So again, what else can domain-driven design help us with? Domain-driven design has this concept of bounded contexts. Okay, we saw that on the strategic side of domain-driven design. What a bounded context means is an element, a group of things that are logically bound together, fulfills a particular business responsibility. If you look into the definition, you start to see independent. You start to see that word again, loosely coupled. Okay? If you take it a step further, and you want to, with the DDD stuff, you have like domain models. You start to implement value objects, entities, policies, aggregates, all sorts of things, right, in the strategic, in the tactical side. Even if you started basic and just took one of these things, the ubiquitous language, it can really help you define some of this and manage some of that complexity. Terms and concepts that are used within the boundary, a lesson, a course, a user, a policy, for example. To give you an example of this, here is a lesson. What does it mean in this particular context? Here is a couple of examples here. You know, I'm going to teach you a lesson on the left, and hopefully you walk away learning something. Or on the right, in the UK where I'm from, if someone says they're going to teach you a lesson, you better kind of run away because you might end up with a black eye. But it's the same kind of context, same message in different kind of contexts. So when it comes to boundaries and bounded contexts and domain-driven design and event-driven architectures, the next step they recommend you to do is mainly probably assign some teams to it. Look at your team topologies in your organization. So we have Team A looking after recommendation engine, we have content managers. We have teams that have multiple boundaries looking after different contexts, but we don't necessarily have teams in the same context because complexity kind of can come from here. So the question here really too is, well, if we are communicating if we have these systems, how the hell do we communicate between them? And the answer, of course, is, well, we can use events and channels, right, and messages. Awesome. So even if you look at this and say we have our boundaries well-defined, our language well-defined, we're using some DDD techniques, are we loosely coupled? Have we beaten complexity? And the answer still is no. Why is that? Because how you consume events as consumers, right, will couple you back to the producer or implement some complexity. And this is super, super important. By default, as you consume an event from a producer, DDD has this concept of bounded context maps, okay, and we're going to explore some, but you are a conformist by default, okay? You are adhering to this. What this means is you are taking the model, you're taking the schema, and you are adhering to it. You are tied, you are coupled to it. Even on the schema, how we consume as consumers. Now, this might be okay, this might be what you want to do, but remember, by default, this is what you are doing. And this can introduce levels of complexity. So, what options do we have? Well, DDD give us an option of something like an anti-corruption layer, okay? So we take the event, the order has been placed. Before we do anything, we translate it into a model, into a language that we understand as consumers. Okay, we're protecting our boundary in our system. So these are things that you might want to do. Examples here, what you'll see starting to emerge, some technologies like Stripe, for example, can raise events directly onto your broker. Now, why would you ever want to be bound to their model and to their schema? So anti-corruption layers kind of make sense. So we start to do that. If you don't want to do that, there are other patterns you can look at called open host service. You, as consumers, push back onto the producer and you say, no, 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 we are going to have a schema, have an event that we all agreed on. The producer, before they even raise an event, they map it into this thing that everyone has agreed. Which, again, could be kind of useful if that's the thing that you want to do. Remember, as I said, by default, you are a conformist. So there is huge value to be had just learning some of these patterns. The other thing you'll see with event-driven architectures is this concept of dumb endpoints and smart pipes. Your producer can just produce whatever the hell they want. Your consumer consumes whatever the hell they're given, but you put the logic onto the pipe itself. Kafka, SQS, EventBridge, EventGrid all have capabilities of routing on the channel, but also mapping on the channel. So you could say, okay, I'm going to take that event and I'm going to map it into something other consumers can do. Now, the question there I always have is, well, this sounds great, awesome, but who the hell manages that mapping? Is it the producer? Is it the consumer? Who has the responsibility? And that's something you have to figure out, and the trade-offs to consider. Other things that you'll often see too are partnerships. I've done partnerships in the past. You may be doing this now. But you're just in close proximity with the team you are consuming from. So you have a partnership. If they are making breaking changes, they probably will let you know, right? Because you're working together on this stuff, and that's totally fine. So these are things you might want to consider there. Equally, the opposite to this is something called separate ways, where you're geographically in different countries, subsidiaries, and organizations, whatever it means. You decide to duplicate the effort, you decide not to talk to that context for whatever reason. This is completely fine. But there are just different ways. Now, the question is, well, when you're building event-driven architectures and you want to communicate with channels and messages, which one should you use? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is, well, it depends. There's the word. But there are things you can think about to help you manage and pick which one works for you. Communication levels are huge between partnerships and conformists. That requires more communication between you and the team, right? Does complexity come here? I don't know. Separate ways, anti-corruption layer requires less communication, protections and things like that. So it really depends on which one you want to use, and you can probably use that communication level to distinguish there. And then I think there's an element of complexity that arises with this. The more we have to communicate with people and sync up and everything else, I don't know. And I think complexity will come in some of these things. There's an awesome book called Learning Domain-Driven Design by Vladik. I highly recommend that. I read it a couple of years ago now. But he says something in here that kind of resonated with me, is like the cost of change is proportional to the distance between components in your systems. Right? And this is an interesting pattern that often trips people up when they build event architectures, is actually understanding the context in which you publish the message itself. Okay? I'll give you an example here. You start to have these words and these terminologies called private events, public events, integration events. We are using Kafka, we're using EventGrid, whatever the hell we use. We're using the same channel, it doesn't really matter. The context of the event matters. Example, private event, the order has been placed, the order has been cancelled, type T_W. Implementation details do not matter because the context can understand it. The people in there can understand it. Public events, integration events are completely different. They are events that you share amongst the teams, other teams, you have to have versioning, contract changes, all sorts of things here. So, the same channel, the same technology, but how you're publishing and mapping these things are completely different, and that often kind of trips people up there. So domain-driven design, like, there are things in there. We just covered some basic things there. How can it help us? And it can help us quite a lot. As I said earlier, the alternative is we implement first and we just YOLO. You will end up in distributed big balls of mud, for sure, right? But we can take some of the DDD stuff and start to manage some of that complexity. And the question, again, still I always have is, like, are we still managing it? Have we beaten it yet? And the answer still, unfortunately, is no. Now, when it comes to event-driven architectures, online you'll start to see a lot of this stuff happen. You'll start to read a lot of stuff. And the first thing you'll read is this one sentence that many, many people adhere to, many people write, and it's the ultimate, in my opinion, the ultimate cause of complexity, right? And it's these words here, is that we read that producers do not know about consumers. It's the whole point that we can publish without caring about who's consuming the event. Now, what tends to happen most of the time is questions in your architecture, that things start to emerge. Questions like this. What events do we have? You've been building event-driven systems for 2 years now. Fantastic. 3 years. What events do we have? Well, I can't actually tell you that. I don't actually know. Well, why don't you know? Well, because producers don't know about consumers. Or the answer that you'll get is go look at the GitHub repo, right, and go figure it out. Okay, well, I can do that. What's the payload of the event? Don't know. I told you to go look at GitHub. Go away. Okay, fair enough. Oh, by the way, I want to make a change to the payload of the event. Who's consuming it? No idea, right? Literally, no idea. And we take it too literally. I see this time and time again with so many organizations is that, yes, producers don't know about consumers. Yes, we can have decoupled architectures. Yes, we can have evolutionary architectures, fantastic. But it doesn't mean we can skip levels of governance. And this is kind of where I pour my heart into because there is such a big problem here. Now, open source and open specifications, there are things out there to help, okay? And here are some of them. So first of all, we have Open API. Hands up if you've heard about this one. Of course, yeah, many people. 2011, the spec was created around that time, Swagger, and now Open API spec to document how your APIs work. If you go into any organization, any enterprise, about 8 times out of 10, I would say, you need to have an Open API file. You'll get pushback, either spec first, code first, whatever. They have specifications. Standards have emerged. Arizo spec, has anyone heard of this one? Cool. Arizo specification, I think it was out last year. It allows you to document flows, orchestration flows. Now, I think a lot about orchestration when it comes to event-driven architectures, and like being able to document from when a user signs up to when they purchase, what the hell was going on in between this? Service calls, events, whatever. Being able to document flows. So if you're into that, you can look at that. Cloud events, has anyone heard of this one? Cool, yeah, a handful of people. Cloud events, highly, highly recommend. All it does is standardizes the envelope, right? So you put the message in, but the envelope is standardized, okay? You don't have to think about it. It has metadata on it, it has correlation IDs, it has sources, all this lovely stuff. Why you would want to do this is because organizations like Microsoft, for example, and AWS are starting to adhere to this specification, meaning it allows us to integrate with things easier. There is no reason, in my opinion, not to do that. So I highly recommend that. X registry, anyone heard of this one? Yeah, okay, no one. X registry is a new specification, be able to have discoverability on resources, i.e. schemas, right? So we can create discoverability endpoints using specifications around resources in our organization. Microsoft are invested heavily in this at the moment, and there should be some more things there. And then finally, async KPIs. Anyone heard of this? Cool, yeah, I love to see that grow. Async KPI is my favorite of them all. Async KPI is a specification that started from a friend of mine, Fran Mendes. He was working at New Relic at the time, and he was trying to document event-driven architectures and like with specifications. The problem with Open API is kind of request-response model, one-to-one, okay? Event-driven architectures, we have the events and producers and consumers and spider webs, right? So how the hell do you model that in something that's so linear? So async API is a fork of Open API, but all it allows you to do, essentially, is document channels, Kafka, whatever channel you're using, document producers, document consumers, and that's kind of it. And what happens there is interesting things, like now we have a machine-readable format. We can actually write tools in this. We can actually like render things like this HTML viewer. And anyone in your organization can go to your service, right, and be able to say, okay, well, what does this service do? You can see here we have an operation, send user signed up. It has a particular channel, particular message, and so on. So we can start to document this stuff. It's no longer a free-for-all. We can actually just start to have specifications to help us, which is fantastic. So when it comes to it, and it comes to domain-driven design, there are lots here we can use. Even if you just start out, cloud events, async API, I highly recommend here. But with DDD, on the other hand, on the other side, and domains and bounded context and all the lovely things with ubiquitous language, is there a bridge between the two? And unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't, but this is something I kind of fell in love with. So I kind of built this thing called Event Catalog, which is like this open source MIT license free thing you can use to help people in this mess. Has anyone heard of Event Catalog? Just curious? Oh, a few people. So Event Catalog is just a discoverability tool. It is a shit show out there. I cannot express that enough of like, what events do we have and all these questions that come up. So I decided 3 years ago to build a tool, okay, open source, whatever, just to help people catalog some of this information so you can get more value out of your event architectures and just manage some of the complexity that comes with it. Adding semantic meaning to events is something I'm really passionate about. Example would be order-placed event. Now, what is that? You'll ask the question, you'll get an Avro schema, you'll get a JSON schema. Where is the business semantic meaning behind that event? What does it mean in your organization? All these things are lost. So why can't we just encapsulate some of this stuff? Why can't we visualize some of this stuff? Why can't we use our events, our services as a story and actually be able to discover some of this stuff? As I said earlier, you will not get around a lot of this complexity, but you can put things in there to manage it. Everything here is markdown driven, so you can kind of do it as you please. But as you see here, we have like ubiquitous language, definitions. What the hell is an auto renewal, a trial period, a plan, a billing cycle? Who knows, right? So you can start to capture some of these things and start to use some of these things in your events. And being able to just, as I said, visualize a story. I'm a very visual person, but we can see here that the service is accepting a query, right? It's accepting an event, and it's publishing some events on that particular channel. You can just automate as much as this one. As I said, I highly recommend async API, but because you can just take documents and open API specs and just tell a story and visualize things easily. Mapping contexts, mapping domains, finding events between them, finding code smells, all this kind of stuff is, I think, possible. And as I said, ubiquitous language, capturing the language in your organization, just making it available to people, right? There's another open source tool, if you're into this kind of stuff, as much as I am, called Contextive. This is from Chris Simon, a friend of mine. But the ability to just document some of this language in a spec file and use it in Slack, use it in your IDE, use it anywhere you want, right? Being able to just talk about these different terms and terminology. Again, from the DDD community, an open source project growing here. If you're as geeky as I am and passionate as I am into this stuff, you can kind of join Discord. There's like almost 1,200 people here at the moment, and yeah, about 28,000 catalogs created. So if you're into that, you can find that on eventcatalog.dev. And kind of going back to it, it's that implementation first, right? And then that complexity that will come with it. And as I said, if you haven't experienced any of what I've talked about, I'd love to talk to you. And domain-driven design, it can help us, right? It can help us manage it, but you'll still have elements of complexity, discoverability, ownership, all these problems that will come. But you can use specifications, open source standards, cloud events, async API. Highly recommend to add a level of governance, a thin level of governance, right? Add that behavior first on top of it, and then start building your event-driven architectures. And that way, you can manage some of the complexity. So as I said, so many people fall into the same mistakes. So with all of that, let's summarize everything I spoke about. At the start of the talk, I mentioned this implementation first, that things are becoming a lot easier for us to just publish. So easy, in fact. You can take this payload, you can take an SDK, and you can publish it into the cloud. A consumer comes along, consumes it, you are event-driven. This is so easy to do. Next, you will see this. Warning signs start to emerge over time. You will not see this at the start. You are 3 people, 5 people, whatever else. Over time, you will see big balls of mud, complexity arise, YOLO events exposing too much information in your events. You'll see no version strategies, how you consume your events, right? Couples you back to it all. So what options do you have? Well, you could look at domain-driven design. You could look at some behavior-first thinking. You could explore some things around domain discovery and getting that shared understanding in the language before you even start to build stuff. You could map out your domains and talk about events and commands and systems and all sorts of things and group things in elements, right? And then you could actually talk between these contexts using event-driven architecture, using messages, using bounded context maps, open host service, conformist. Remember what I said, by default you are conforming. Do you want to do that? Yes or no? Think about this. Finally, there are open source things out there, specifications you can read. If you haven't got time, I highly recommend Cloud Events, Async API. Have a look at them. They will get you some way there. Can complexity, can DDD help us? Yes, I think it can. Don't fall into the trap of the implementation first. Finally, there's a resource here. I wrote a book. It's free to download. It's got like over 100 different kind of deep dive things on event-driven architectures. You can just grab that for free. As I said, I've been geeking out on this subject for quite a while. And all the slides, resources, deeper dive, everything you need to know is in this one here on GitHub. And I appreciate your time. Hope you learned something. I'm around for the rest of the day if anyone's got questions. And thank you very much for listening. Awesome stuff.